What if I told you that some of the most disturbing creature features from the 60s and early 70s were buried not because they failed, but because they frightened the wrong people? Films that blurred the line between art and nightmare. Movies that governments whispered about and studios disowned. Tonight, we dig into the shadows to uncover 11 forbidden monster films you were never meant to see. Number 11. The Flesh Eaters, 1964. When it first hit drive-ins across America, The Flesh Eaters was dismissed as another cheap monster flick. But under its modest budget beat one of the most vicious hearts of the decade. The story follows stranded vacationers trapped on a remote island with microscopic creatures that literally devour human flesh alive. The violence was relentless, and the gore practical effects shocked even hardened horror fans. Critics in 1964 were horrified. Newspapers refused to print the title. One reviewer called it an abomination filmed in a sewer. Several states banned it outright for indecency. The distributor panicked and re-edited the ending to remove what they called excessive dissolving flesh. Behind the camera, director Jack Curtis fought censors for months. He defended the film as a metaphor for atomic anxiety. But theaters dropped it after protests by family groups. For years, the only surviving prints were bootlegs passed among collectors. Today, The Flesh Eaters is seen as a missing link between drive-in pulp and the coming wave of body horror. Its legacy is small but undeniable proof that low budgets could birth high terror. Number 10. Island of Terror, 1966. Terence Fisher's Island of Terror looked like a simple British creature thriller. A laboratory accident spawns boneless creatures that crawl through an island feeding on calcium from living victims. Yet what seemed routine turned macabre. The monsters were silent, rubber nightmares, leaving victims collapsed like empty skin. British censors nearly pulled it before release, fearing its depiction of disfigured corpses. Television networks refused to broadcast it for over a decade. The studio trimmed entire reels for international markets, especially in Australia and Canada, where authorities warned it could cause fainting fits. Behind the scenes, the production was haunted by real dread. The mechanical creatures malfunctioned constantly, and an effects technician was injured during a test explosion. Lead actor Peter Cushing reportedly refused to watch the final cut, saying it felt too close to necrosis. Over time, Island of Terror gained cult devotion. Fans praised its eerie atmosphere and rural isolation themes. What began as pulp evolved into allegory for scientific arrogance. Decades later, even modern filmmakers cite it as an influence on alien horror aesthetics. It proved that quiet horror often cuts deepest, and that suppression only strengthens myth. Number 9. Equinox, 1967. Before The Evil Dead Before Any Cabin in the Woods craze came Equinox. Made by a group of young film students with almost no money, it told of 4 friends who discover an ancient book summoning demons from another dimension. What started as enthusiasm became chaos. Its stop-motion monsters were crude but hypnotic. The film mixed surrealism with Lovecraftian dread in a way that terrified distributors. When producer Jack H. Harris bought it, he re-edited everything without the director's consent, turning the film into 2 versions, one approved and one forbidden. The uncut original was too strange for release, containing ritualistic scenes and cosmic imagery the studio feared would invite controversy. For years, Equinox circulated through underground screenings. The mainstream industry ignored it, yet it quietly influenced an entire generation of independent horror directors. Sam Raimi later admitted it planted seeds for his own demonic universe. When restored decades later, audiences realized its raw imagination outmatched its flaws. Equinox had predicted the modern horror formula and survived its own erasure. A true monster film born from passion, suppressed by fear, and resurrected by fans who refuse to forget. Number 8. The Projected Man, 1966. On paper, The Projected Man was a modest British science experiment thriller. A scientist attempts to teleport matter across space and instead melts his own body into a glowing monstrosity. But what looked like routine B cinema became a cautionary tale about ambition gone feral both on and off camera. The film's release was riddled with panic. British distributors trimmed it for violence after test audiences fainted during the disintegration sequence. Television refused to air it, citing imagery too grotesque for home viewing. In America, the Motion Picture Association slapped it with the dreaded adults-only label that limited screenings to midnight showings. The press mocked its low budget, yet could not ignore its strange intensity. Behind the scenes, director Ian Curtis clashed violently with producers over time and money. Sets were abandoned mid-production, and actors rehearsed in freezing warehouses. Some claimed the malfunctioning projector prop actually burned through the film stock, causing literal smoke on set. Post-production was finished by another team who secretly recut the ending to tone down the existential despair. When it resurfaced decades later, critics noticed something haunting. Beneath the rough effects lay a story about dehumanization through science. What once drew laughter began earning admiration for its grim sincerity. The projected man's survival is itself miraculous. It reminds us that sometimes the cheapest monsters carry the most honest pain. Number 7. The Green Slime, 1968. Few films better represent late 60s chaos than The Green Slime. A joint American-Japanese production, it promised space adventure and delivered cosmic absurdity. Astronauts destroy an asteroid only to bring back glowing spores that evolve into tentacled creatures feeding on energy. What begins as pulp erupts into psychedelic panic as monsters multiply across a space station, drowning it in neon blood. At first, audiences laughed, but governments did not. The U.S. military reportedly objected to its depiction of incompetent astronauts and demanded edits before overseas release. In Japan, conservative press labeled it disgraceful science fiction due to its grotesque creature design. Several television networks refused reruns fearing children would imitate the slimy effects. Behind the camera, it was total mayhem. American star Robert Horton clashed with Japanese director Kinji Fukasaku over tone. The language barrier created constant misunderstanding. At one point, the monsters were accidentally set on fire during shooting, yet actors continued performing amid toxic fumes. Crew members later recalled the experience as both hilarious and traumatizing. Years later, fans reclaimed The Green Slime as the first psychedelic monster epic. Its manic energy inspired later cult classics, and even influenced the creature aesthetics in Ridley Scott's Alien. What once embarrassed studios now glows with ironic brilliance, a loud reminder that excess often creates immortality. Number 6. Night of the Lepus, 1972. Some legends are so bizarre they feel like fever dreams. Night of the Lepus was MGM's doomed attempt to turn rabbits into monsters. The story follows a small town besieged by giant mutated hares spawned from scientific meddling. The studio believed audiences wanted a new eco-horror trend, but what they got instead was absurd terror. Critics initially mocked it, calling it rabbit apocalypse gone wrong. Yet behind the laughter, there was genuine unease. The film's original version was far darker, featuring bloodier attacks and a nihilistic ending. When test audiences reacted with horror, MGM panicked. The violence was cut, and the marketing campaign scrubbed all mention of rabbits from posters, replacing them with shadowy claws. On-set production, chaos reigned. Miniature sets collapsed under the weight of trained rabbits. Actors performed with fear not of monsters, but of being fired from what they suspected would end their careers. Janet Leigh later admitted she took the role out of contractual obligation and never watched the premiere. For decades, Night of the Lepus was a cinematic punchline. Yet, as environmental horror resurfaced in later years, the film gained new relevance. Beneath its clumsy execution lay an eerie warning about human interference with nature. In its strange sincerity, Night of the Lepus became a creature feature, too surreal to ever die. Number 5. Zontar, The Thing from Venus, 1966. In the mid-60s, American television was saturated with space optimism, but Zontar, The Thing from Venus, tore that optimism apart. A remake of Roger Corman's earlier It Conquered the World. It was filmed for almost no money, yet carried a message more dangerous than any blockbuster dared to express. On paper, it was just another alien invasion tale. In reality, it became a metaphor for control propaganda and blind trust in authority. The plot follows a disillusioned scientist who makes contact with an alien from Venus, promising world peace through technology. Instead, the alien enslaves humanity using electrical mind control. Its victims speak in hollow monotones, echoing political slogans of the era. For 1966, that imagery hit too close to home. The Cold War paranoia was still raging, and network censors demanded the filmmakers cut scenes showing soldiers turning against their government. Behind the camera, chaos was constant. Director Larry Buchanan fought studio interference on every reel. His crew worked with reused monster suits and malfunctioning lighting rigs that overheated the set. Actors performed through exhaustion, while Buchanan rewrote dialogue nightly to avoid further censorship. When the film finally aired on late-night television, it terrified audiences. Not because of its rubber alien, but because it mirrored the real fear of ideological control. Critics dismissed it as laughable, yet letters poured into stations from viewers claiming they understood what the film was really saying. Decades later, film historians recognized Zontar as proto-political sci-fi cloaked in pulp aesthetics. Its once-derided creature became symbolic of manipulation through media, long before the digital age made that metaphor literal. What was mocked as a failure in 1966 now plays like prophecy. The alien from Venus never left. It simply changed form. Number 4. The Beast of Yucca Flats, 1961. If horror had a nightmare home movie, this would be it. The Beast of Yucca Flats is a film that looks broken from the first frame. Shot silently and dubbed later to save money, it follows a Soviet scientist who survives a nuclear blast in the Nevada desert only to mutate into a lumbering killer. No soundtrack, no sync sound, just wind and radiation. Upon its release, it was condemned by nearly every critic who saw it. The Los Angeles censors considered banning it for its disturbing realism. Even drive-ins hesitated to show it, fearing the government might see its depiction of atomic testing as anti-American. But what they missed was its grim artistry. The narration spoke like an obituary for humanity, and the landscapes looked genuinely scorched. Production was a nightmare. Director Coleman Francis filmed on abandoned government land under constant fear of arrest. The crew had no permits and often shot at dawn to avoid military patrols. The camera jammed repeatedly due to desert dust. Actors nearly collapsed from heat stroke. The mutated killer played by Tor Johnson moved so slowly through the wasteland that his exhaustion became part of the performance. The film was almost lost after distributors refused to pay for Prince. It resurfaced decades later as a cult phenomenon. Modern viewers saw beyond its flaws. They felt its loneliness, its terror of fallout and decay. It became an accidental time capsule of post-war dread, raw, haunting, and eerily prophetic. The Beast of Yucca Flats may have been shunned, but its quiet desolation outlasted the polished monsters of its era. Sometimes, ruin tells the truest story. Number 3. It's Alive, 1969. Not to be confused with Larry Cohen's later film this earlier, It's Alive by Larry Buchanan is a different kind of horror. Low budget, yes, but brimming with existential panic. The story begins innocently enough. A young couple stumbles upon a strange zoo run by a lonely man in the Texas desert. Beneath his compound lies something ancient trapped in a watery pit. When the creature emerges, the tone changes from pulp to fever dream. The monster is barely seen, just glimpses of scales and desperate eyes. But the real terror comes from the setting. Silence, claustrophobia, sunlight turning to shadow. The dialogue feels improvised, as if the actors themselves feared what might crawl out of the pit next. Rumors spread that scenes were inspired by true disappearances near a military testing zone. Local officials reportedly complained about the film's use of restricted areas and threatened to confiscate reels. Television refused to air it. The studio buried it under a misleading poster campaign advertising a mutant baby movie that did not exist. Behind the scenes, Buchanan shot in near darkness using borrowed lights from a motel parking lot. A generator explosion halted filming for days. Actors were unpaid, and morale collapsed. Yet somehow, the film survived. When it reappeared decades later, critics saw it differently. Its minimalist dread and eerie landscapes felt closer to art house horror than exploitation. In the end, It's Alive became more than a creature feature. It became a whisper from an age terrified of science and secrecy. A monster film without spectacle that understood the greatest fear is isolation itself. Number 2. The Vulture, 1967. Among the strangest British horror experiments of the 60s, The Vulture stands as a cautionary tale about how far filmmakers would go to merge folklore science and Cold War paranoia. It was meant to be a straightforward monster movie part, gothic mystery part, atomic horror. But what emerged was a surreal hybrid so disturbing that even its own studio tried to erase it. The story follows a small Cornish village haunted by the legend of an 18th century baron who was supposedly buried alive, clutching his pet vulture. When a scientist disturbs the grave centuries later, a winged creature begins slaughtering villagers, leaving only feathers and fear behind. Critics dismissed the premise as absurd, yet the tone was anything but campy. The film oozed dread, using bleak coastal fog and decaying mansions to mirror Britain's post-war disillusionment. When The Vulture premiered in 1967, British censors demanded multiple cuts to remove scenes of dismemberment and grave exhumation. Some theaters refused to show it altogether, calling it blasphemous nonsense. Religious groups protested outside cinemas, accusing the film of satanic imagery due to its fusion of resurrection and mutation. American distributors delayed its release for nearly a year, fearing moral backlash during a period already tense with censorship battles. Behind the scenes, the production was an exercise in chaos. Director Lawrence Huntington reportedly clashed with producers daily, while star Robert Hutton, an American trying to revive his career, often complained that the script changed every morning. The vulture creature built from recycled bird props and mechanical wings broke down repeatedly, forcing last-minute rewrites that left its final form barely visible on screen. Yet in that absence, the horror grew stronger. The film's limitations turned it into a fever dream of unseen terror. Decades later, cult audiences rediscovered the vulture, praising its strange poetry and atmosphere of decaying grandeur. Beneath its flaws lies a haunting metaphor, the idea that old sins once unearthed will always find flesh to inhabit again. The vulture was mocked in its time, but endures as a fossil of fear half forgotten and wholly unsettling. Number 1. Equinox, Uncut version, 1967. By the time Equinox resurfaced in its original unedited form, it was clear that the world had almost buried a landmark of independent horror. Long before Hollywood polished supernatural terror into big-budget spectacle, four young filmmakers, Dennis Muren, Dave Allen, Jim Danforth, and Mark McGee, crafted this strange vision of cosmic doom with nothing but stop-motion monsters, borrowed cameras, and raw obsession. On the surface, Equinox tells a simple story. Four friends venture into the woods, discover an ancient book, and accidentally open a portal to hell. But what made it revolutionary was its tone, dreamlike, disjointed, almost mystical. The camera lingered on misty valleys and haunted skies, while clay monsters lumbered like living metaphors for human arrogance. When producer Jack H. Harris purchased the film, he ordered a full reshoot and edit demanding a clearer narrative. The result was two different versions, one clean enough for television, and one so disturbing it remained unseen. The uncut version featured whispered incantations, infernal drawings, and dialogue, hinting at forbidden knowledge. Studio executives panicked, calling it too unholy for commercial release. They buried the reels, and only bootleg collectors kept it alive. Behind the scenes, production was brutal. The filmmakers slept in cars shot on weekends and nearly froze while animating demons frame by frame in open fields. Equipment constantly broke. Actors vanished mid-shoot due to exhaustion, yet their determination birthed something timeless, a cinematic bridge between stop-motion, fantasy, and psychological horror. When the full Equinox resurfaced decades later, audiences realized it was not just a student project. It was a prophecy. Its themes of forbidden knowledge, parallel realities, and demonic intrusion predicted the entire cabin in the woods genre. Directors like Sam Raimi and Guillermo del Toro later cited it as inspiration. Equinox endures not because of its monsters, but because of its purity of fear, the sense that the universe is vast, indifferent, and watching. It was a film too visionary for its time and too personal to die. A creature feature that became a scripture for every dreamer who dared to summon terror from nothing but faith and film. These forgotten creature features were not just movies, they were warnings. Each reel a reflection of our deepest dread, each monster born from fear of progress, secrecy, or control. Which of these buried nightmares haunts you most? Tell us in the comments. Like, subscribe, and keep your eyes open because some monsters were never meant to stay dead.